a chapter in the book. It's called The Emotional Geography of War. And it's something I wanted to put in a discussion of the Second World War. And it really is about, it's about the degree of trauma, emotional trauma, and so on, that civilians and military alike go through as a result of war and how they cope with that. Because one of the big questions about the Second World War is that these are mainly civilian armies. They're mobilized civilians, tens of millions of them. Most of them never thought they'd be fighting a world war. They have very mixed capabilities. How do you get them to fight? How do you get them organized, put weapons in their hand, tell them to kill each other? And what's the consequence? And that chapter is really about explaining, how you overcome the emotional crisis that many people go through when they are confronted with this thing, kill or be killed. What coping mechanisms do they find? How do civilians cope under bombardment? And that's an aspect of the war. And it's a horrible aspect of the war because very, very high proportion of those in uniform did become psychiatric casualties. It's an aspect of the war that tends to be glossed over, particularly in Western accounts where it's the good war, the heroic war, and so on. But it's, for the people involved, it's a messy war. It's a traumatic experience. It's an emotional roller coaster. And I think that reading that should remind the modern generation that, that war is a terrible thing and it does terrible things to the people that actually wage it, as we can see on our screens in the war between Ukraine and Russia.
And so how did the United States mobilize its people versus the way perhaps a Britain or France or the Japanese, their people? What were the differences and nuances between those countries?
Well, it was difficult in the United States because they rejected almost 2 million recruits at the recruiting stations for potentials, because we're potentially psychologically unsuitable. And you did that with a quick 15-minute interview, asking some rather strange questions. But 2 million were already rejected. So the assumption was that those who were accepted would probably be, psychologically more capable. But great effort was made to persuade them that they would all feel fear, but don't worry, you can overcome it. The majority of people in the American army didn't fight, of course. There was a huge managerial and logistic tail to the American army. Those who did fight, well, in North Africa, there were 25% psychiatric casualties. So people didn't adapt. A very high proportion of people didn't adapt. In the battles in Normandy, in all three armies, British, Canadian, American, very high level of psychiatric casualty. You had to keep feeding men in, and they in turn they became either medical or psychiatric casualties. For a civilian army, it was a difficult transition. And in most cases, people found ways of coping. The small unit, commitment to their mates. In fact, that's what most American soldiers, when interviewed, talked about. That even they were fearful, they didn't want to fight there, but they didn't want to let their mates down. And that was one of the things that drove them on, as it drove on soldiers in all armies. Your local group, your mates, your local officer, perhaps. Those are the people you're fighting for, because you don't see the wider war.
And was Japanese culture different, or the same kind of phenomenon that was studied post the war on soldiers and civilians?
Well, the Japanese assumed that there were no psychiatric casualties. And they did have a handful of psychologists attached to the army, but their purpose was to try and find out why some Japanese soldiers tried to kill their officers. They were not interested in the Japanese as psychiatric casualties. They got no treatment. A few who were regarded as completely psychotic were sent back to punishment units back in mainland Japan, but they kept their soldiers fighting by ferocious level of discipline. And ordinary Japanese, of course, coped, as other armies did, of course, by trying to create small solidarities with their mates, and hoping that they would somehow or other survive. But the ethos for the Japanese military is very different. You know, there's no conscientious objection, no psychiatric casualties, and you fight to the death.
Fascinating subject. Yeah, we urge all our viewers and listeners to go on to Amazon, as I did, Blood and Ruins, The Last Imperial War, 1931 to 1945. Professor Richard Overy, again, thank you very, very much for your time. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you very much.